At 0900 on February 19, 1945, Corporal Tony Stein crouched behind a shallow fold in black volcanic sand, gripping a weapon his sergeant had called a stupid idea 3 months earlier. He was 23, had flown 6 landings, and had not killed anyone the manual would count. In front of him, the beach of Iwo Jima was already a graveyard. Japanese machine guns fired from positions no one could see, their barrels hidden inside rock and sand that looked exactly like the ground Marines were dying on. Mortar rounds walked the terrace in measured steps, forcing men to stay down or disappear. Tanks were stuck, their tracks buried in ash that flowed like water and swallowed steel. Naval shells screamed overhead, but they could not hit what they could not identify. Every second the line stayed still, another body went down. Stein knew the doctrine. Assault infantry advanced behind machine guns, not with them. Suppression came first, then movement. The problem was that the machine guns were 31 pounds empty, slow to carry, and anchored to positions that no longer existed once the men moved. What Stein held weighed less, fired 3 times faster, and had never been meant to touch the ground. It was an aircraft gun, salvaged from wreckage, stripped of anything that made it safe or sensible. The men around him had laughed. They had called it unreliable, uncontrollable, suicidal. Standing upright, Stein felt the heat of the barrel bleed through the receiver. He could hear his breathing over the gunfire, could feel the sand slide under his boots. He stood anyway. He stood because if he stayed down, nothing would change. He stood because someone had to force the enemy to show itself. When he stepped forward, Japanese gunners did exactly what they had been trained to do. They fired. Muzzle flashes bloomed from the hillside, brief sparks of light against black rock. Stein swung the weapon toward the light and pressed the trigger. The sound was not a burst, but a tearing roar, a solid wall of noise that drowned everything else. The first position went silent. Then another. And another. Marines behind him began to move. What was supposed to be impossible was happening. And by every rule written before that morning, it should have killed him. The men who landed on Iwo Jima that morning were not unprepared. They had trained for amphibious assault for years. They knew the sequence by memory: suppress, maneuver, consolidate. Heavy weapons pinned the enemy. Riflemen advanced. Tanks followed. It was a system refined across the Pacific, written into manuals, rehearsed on beaches from California to Hawaii. On paper, it worked. Iwo Jima broke that paper. The island was only 8 square miles, but it had been hollowed out like a machine part. 17,000 Japanese defenders lived underground, connected by miles of tunnels that let them fire, disappear, and reappear somewhere else entirely. Their machine guns were not placed to defend the beach, they were placed to kill the men who survived it. Fields of fire overlapped by design, not accident. Every approach had been measured. Every dead space had been eliminated. The doctrine assumed visible targets. Iwo Jima offered none. American machine guns could suppress what they could see. They could not suppress rock that did not reveal itself. A standard Browning M1919 weighed over 30 pounds before ammunition. It required setup, stability, time. It was excellent at holding ground. It was terrible at taking it. On Iwo Jima, ground did not stay taken. The volcanic ash absorbed movement. Boots sank inches with every step. Men who tried to rush forward found themselves slowed, upright, and exposed. Tanks, meant to be the breakthrough weapon, bogged down almost immediately. Their tracks spun uselessly in ash that behaved more like liquid than soil. Naval gunfire thundered overhead, but without clear targets, it was noise without effect. Artillery observers could not see firing slits no wider than a helmet brim. By mid-morning, the 5th Marine Division was paying for every yard with blood. Men died not because they advanced, but because they could not. Pinned units became targets. Targets became casualties. Every delay compounded the losses. The correct response, according to doctrine, was patience. Wait for tanks. Wait for clearer observation. Wait for coordinated fire. Waiting on Iwo Jima meant dying in place. This was the wall every Marine on that beach faced. No maneuver without suppression. No suppression without visible targets. No visible targets without movement. And no movement without someone standing up first. The manuals did not address this loop. They assumed a battlefield that responded to pressure in predictable ways. Iwo Jima did not respond. It absorbed. To advance, someone had to do something the system was not designed to allow. Someone had to bring suppressive fire forward, into the assault, not behind it. That meant mobility. It meant weight reduction. It meant accepting heat, recoil, and ammunition consumption that doctrine avoided for good reason. And it meant exposing a single human being to every gun on the island. There was no official solution to that problem. No issued weapon fit the requirement. No approved tactic covered the risk. The Marine Corps had built its assault doctrine around coordination and redundancy, not improvisation by individuals. The idea that one man could create momentum ran against everything the system believed about modern war. Yet on that beach, the system had stalled. This was the impossible mission not written in any order. Advance without cover. Suppress without positions. Move without doctrine. For most men, the only rational choice was to stay down and survive the next minute. For one man, that minute was already unacceptable. Before Tony Stein ever stood up on that beach, no one had mistaken him for a hero. He did not speak like an officer. He did not think like one either. Stein was a toolmaker before the war, trained to measure problems in fractions, tolerances, and failure points. Steel either held or it did not. Machines either did what they were designed to do, or they killed the people relying on them. That mindset followed him into the Marine Corps. He noticed things other men ignored. How weight slowed movement. How heat ruined reliability. How small inefficiencies multiplied under stress. While others memorized doctrine, Stein watched equipment fail during training and asked why it was accepted as normal. Most Marines learned to work around limitations. Stein wanted to remove them. That attitude made him useful. It also made him suspect. The weapon he carried onto the beach was not born from inspiration. It came from irritation. During training, Stein watched machine gun crews fall behind advancing rifle platoons, forced to stop, set up, fire, then dismantle everything just to move again. Momentum died every time. The doctrine blamed coordination. Stein blamed physics. When he helped adapt an aircraft machine gun for ground combat, reactions were immediate and divided. Some men saw ingenuity. Most saw danger. An aircraft gun fired too fast. Its barrel was too thin. Its appetite for ammunition was obscene. There was a reason it had never been issued to infantry. Officers tolerated it because it was easier than arguing with a corporal who could build his own solutions. Non-commissioned officers tolerated it because Stein carried it himself. Nobody wanted responsibility for it. That mattered. Stein was not protected by rank or reputation. If the weapon failed, there would be no investigation, no revision of doctrine. There would be a dead corporal and a lesson quietly forgotten. That understanding sat with him long before the ramps dropped on Iwo Jima. He was not blind to the risks. He knew the barrel would overheat. He knew ammunition would disappear in seconds. He knew that carrying it forward would make him a priority target. Every objection raised by skeptics was technically correct. What they did not see was the larger equation. Stein understood that doctrine existed to protect units, not individuals. On Iwo Jima, units were being destroyed anyway. The system assumed time. Time was the one resource the Marines on that beach did not have. This was where doubt crept in, even for him. Standing in the sand, hearing rounds snap overhead, Stein did not feel certainty. He felt calculation under pressure. If he stood up, he would draw fire. If he drew fire, he could locate it. If he could locate it, his weapon could suppress it. If suppression held even briefly, men behind him could move. Every step relied on the previous one working. There was no margin. Around him, Marines stayed low, doing exactly what training had taught them to do. Survive the immediate threat. Wait for orders. Wait for support. Stein was about to violate that entire chain. To the men watching, it looked reckless. A single corporal exposing himself in the open with an unapproved weapon looked less like courage and more like panic. Some assumed he had cracked. Others assumed he would be dead in seconds. Stein did not see it that way. He did not believe bravery would save him. He believed predictability might. Japanese gunners were disciplined. They fired when targets presented themselves. If he presented himself deliberately, he could force a reaction on his terms, not theirs. That belief ran directly against instinct. Every survival reflex screamed to stay down. Every institutional instinct reinforced it. Stein chose to ignore both. This was the moment where his story separates from mythology. He was not fearless. He was unconvinced that fear was relevant. Fear did not change weight. It did not cool barrels. It did not move men off a killing ground. Only action did. By the time he shifted his footing in the ash and prepared to stand, Stein was already isolated. Not physically, but conceptually. He was no longer operating inside doctrine or expectation. Whatever happened next would belong entirely to him. And if it failed, no one else would be blamed. The problem on Iwo Jima was not courage. It was mass. American infantry doctrine relied on weight where it mattered most. The Browning M1919 machine gun delivered controllable fire, sustained bursts, and reliability under heat. It also weighed over 30 pounds before ammunition, required a crew, and demanded time to set up correctly. Those characteristics were acceptable in defense. They were lethal in an assault that required constant movement. Stein understood that trade-off intuitively. The aircraft gun he carried had been designed for an entirely different environment. In the air, weight was everything. Barrels were thin because airflow cooled them. Rate of fire was extreme because engagements lasted seconds, not minutes. Reliability was acceptable if it held together long enough to win a pass. On the ground, those design choices became liabilities. Thin steel overheated without airflow. A high cyclic rate meant ammunition disappeared faster than it could be replaced. Recoil stressed parts that had never been meant to absorb it without mounting hardware. Stein accepted all of that. What mattered to him was not sustained fire. It was immediate suppression. At over 1,000 rounds per minute, the aircraft gun did something the M1919 could not do while moving. It overwhelmed positions before the enemy could adjust. Accuracy became secondary. Volume became decisive. This was the first blind spot in American doctrine on Iwo Jima. The system assumed that suppression had to be stable, deliberate, and sustained. It did not account for a weapon that could dominate a position for only a few seconds but do so repeatedly while advancing. The second blind spot was mobility. A weapon that could be carried by a single man changed the geometry of the battlefield. Instead of anchoring firepower to a point, Stein dragged it forward. Every time he advanced, suppression advanced with him. Japanese positions were forced to respond to a moving threat rather than a fixed one. That movement exposed the third blind spot, predictability. Japanese defenders were trained to engage advancing waves, not individuals who deliberately presented themselves to draw fire. When Stein stood upright, gunners reacted exactly as training dictated. They fired immediately. In doing so, they revealed positions that had been invisible moments earlier. The aircraft gun punished that reflex brutally. Each burst was short, violent, and unsustainable by design. Stein was not trying to win a firefight. He was trying to create windows measured in seconds. Seconds were enough. Those seconds let riflemen move. They let grenades get close. They let engineers approach firing slits that would otherwise have cut them down. The cost of this approach was cumulative and unavoidable. Heat built with every burst. Metal discolored. Wood charred. The solenoid trigger Stein had fabricated by hand began to degrade. Sometimes it stuck. Sometimes it fired when he did not want it to. The weapon was dying even as it worked. Ammunition was worse. 100 rounds disappeared in seconds. Every engagement forced Stein to choose between advancing further or turning back to resupply under fire. The doctrine assumed ammunition flowed rear to front through organized chains. Stein inverted that flow. He became his own supply line. The terrain magnified every flaw. Volcanic ash destroyed traction. Boot soles disintegrated. Each pound of equipment slowed movement just enough to matter when running exposed across open ground. The island punished weight relentlessly. Stein responded by removing it. Boots were abandoned. Helmet discarded. Protection traded for speed. None of these decisions made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a system that functioned just long enough to matter. This was the deeper failure of doctrine on Iwo Jima. The system optimized for endurance. The battle demanded immediacy. It punished anything that could not adapt in seconds. Stein did not solve the problem permanently. His weapon degraded with every engagement. His body absorbed punishment with every run. There was no path where this approach remained viable indefinitely. But permanence was not the requirement. The requirement was momentum. As long as the weapon fired, even imperfectly, it forced the enemy to react. As long as Stein could move faster than the Japanese could adjust, the balance tilted. The moment that balance shifted, even briefly, the entire battlefield changed. By the time the weapon began to fail in his hands, it had already done its job. The impossible had been reduced to the temporary. And on Iwo Jima, temporary was enough. There was no dramatic pause before the decision. No shouted order. No signal flare. The moment arrived quietly, buried inside routine chaos. By late morning on February 19, the advance had stalled again. Company A had moved forward in fragments, not as a line. Each gain created a new pocket of exposure. Japanese fire adjusted faster now, snapping toward movement instead of waiting for it. The element of surprise was thinning. This was the point where doctrine demanded restraint. The weapon Stein carried was overheating. The barrel radiated heat through the receiver. The improvised trigger no longer returned cleanly after every burst. Ammunition was nearly gone again. Every textbook solution said the same thing: stop, consolidate, wait for support. That solution assumed support would arrive in time. Stein did not have that luxury. Ahead of him, a reinforced position blocked the route inland. Two approaches had already failed. Four Marines lay dead in front of it, bodies twisted into the ash where momentum had died. The firing slit was narrow, perfectly angled, and protected by overlapping positions farther back. If the unit stayed down, more men would be added to that line. Stein understood the cost immediately. If he advanced alone, he would draw every gun. If the weapon failed mid-run, he would die in open ground. If it worked, only briefly, it might be enough to break the position and restore movement. This was not a gamble in the way it is usually imagined. It was a forced choice. The rules existed to reduce risk over time. Time was exactly what the situation no longer allowed. Stein stood. Not halfway. Not cautiously. Fully upright. The response was instant. Japanese fire snapped toward him from multiple angles, round striking ash where he had been seconds earlier. He did not sprint. Running invited panic and wasted ammunition. He advanced at a measured pace, weapon shouldered, eyes fixed on the firing slit. At 50 yards, he opened fire. The aircraft gun tore loose in his hands, recoil hammering through his shoulders. The burst lasted seconds. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that erased individual shots. Rock shattered. Sandbags collapsed inward. The enemy gun went silent. Stein did not wait to confirm. He closed the remaining distance and finished the position with a grenade. Only then did he turn back. The ammunition box was empty. That was the moment the decision truly locked in. He could retreat to cover and let the unit attempt to exploit the opening. Or he could become the mechanism that kept the assault moving. Stein chose the second option. He turned and ran back toward the beach. This violated another rule. Moving rearward under fire was considered wasteful, even cowardly, unless ordered. Stein ran anyway, crossing open ground that Japanese gunners now understood was critical. Rounds chased him. Mortars bracketed the route. Halfway down, he encountered a wounded Marine who could not walk. Stein did not stop to weigh options. He lifted the man and kept moving. The return trip took longer. Weight changed everything. At the supply point, Stein did not argue or explain. He grabbed ammunition and turned immediately. The corpsman took the wounded man. There was no exchange of words. On the way back up, Stein felt the problem worsen. Boot soles were failing. The ash ground them down with every step. The friction slowed him just enough to matter. He reached the unit breathing hard, loaded the weapon, and fired again. This cycle repeated. Advance. Suppress. Run back. Carry wounded. Resupply. Advance again. Each iteration made the situation more dangerous. Japanese snipers began to anticipate his route. Fire adjusted faster. The weapon degraded visibly. Wood blackened. Metal discolored. At some point during those runs, Stein stopped thinking of himself as a Marine executing an assault. He became infrastructure. As long as he moved, ammunition flowed. As long as he fired, others advanced. As long as he stayed upright, the enemy reacted predictably. The decision was no longer whether this violated doctrine. The decision was whether to stop. Stopping meant the weapon cooled, but the unit stalled. Stopping meant fewer risks for one man and more deaths for many. Stopping meant returning control to a system that had already failed. Stein did not stop. By the time his boots finally disintegrated, the choice had already been made. Barefoot on volcanic ash, bleeding, exhausted, he continued because the alternative had been eliminated earlier. This was not heroism in the abstract. It was momentum maintained through refusal. The rules had been broken deliberately, not out of defiance, but because they no longer applied. And once broken, there was no way back. The first minutes after the rules broke did not look like chaos. They looked like progress. When Tony Stein fired, the battlefield responded exactly as his calculations predicted. Japanese positions that had dominated the beach for hours hesitated. Not because they were destroyed outright, but because the volume of fire forced gunners to duck, reload, or reposition. That hesitation, measured in seconds, was enough. Riflemen moved. Men who had been pinned flat in the ash rose and advanced behind the sound of the aircraft gun. They did not wait for orders. They understood instinctively that when the Stinger was firing, the enemy was not. Movement followed noise, not rank. Stein advanced again, closing distances that had been lethal moments earlier. Each burst was short. 5 seconds. Sometimes less. He never tried to hold a position down indefinitely. That would have burned the barrel and emptied the ammunition. Instead, he treated suppression like a series of doors kicked open just long enough to step through. The weapon was still within its tolerances. Barely. The barrel glowed faintly after sustained bursts. Heat shimmered above it in the cold morning air. The smell of burned oil and scorched wood clung to Stein's hands and uniform. But the gun fed. The trigger responded. The system held. That mattered more than comfort. Each time a Japanese position went silent, Stein surged forward, finished the job, and turned back without waiting for confirmation. He did not count bodies. He counted space gained. Behind him, Company A began to stretch out of its original landing zone. 200 yards inland. Then 3. The beachhead, once static, started to breathe. The cost of that momentum was immediate and personal. Ammunition vanished faster than expected. 100 rounds disappeared in seconds of firing time, not minutes. Stein found himself running the same route again and again, exposed to increasingly accurate fire. The enemy learned quickly. By the third run, Japanese gunners had begun bracketing his path with mortars. The fourth run drew sniper fire. Rounds snapped close enough to make the air hiss beside his ears. Each trip became more dangerous than the last. Stein adapted by stripping weight. The helmet came off first. It slowed his movement and offered little protection against a direct hit. Then the boots began to fail. Volcanic ash chewed through the soles relentlessly. Each step lost efficiency. Each stumble wasted time. When the boots finally collapsed, Stein stopped, unlaced them, and left them behind without ceremony. Barefoot, he ran faster. The ash was coarse, sharp enough to tear skin, but it gave traction. Without rubber between his feet and the ground, Stein could feel the terrain shift and adjust his stride. Pain registered. It did not alter the calculation. The runs blurred together. Advance under fire. Suppress. Destroy. Turn. Run. On every return trip, Stein found wounded Marines in the open. Some could not walk. Some were bleeding out. He did not choose which to help based on severity. He took the first he reached. Each rescue added weight. Each added risk. Each delayed his return to the front. Yet those delays did not stop the advance. They synchronized it. Marines began to expect that when Stein went down the beach, he would come back with ammunition. They planned their movement around it. When he fired, they moved. When he stopped, they held. Without orders, a rhythm formed. This was control, but it was fragile. The stinger was deteriorating. The barrel darkened from heat. The wooden furniture charred and cracked. The improvised trigger began to behave unpredictably, sometimes sticking, sometimes firing shorter bursts than intended. Stein compensated by firing in shorter intervals, riding the edge of reliability. Japanese resistance adjusted as well. Machine gunners began to fire in bursts instead of sustained streams, conserving ammunition and waiting for movement. Snipers shifted positions after each shot. Mortar teams walked fire methodically along likely routes of advance. The enemy was no longer reacting blindly. They were learning. Still, the balance held. At around midday, Stein encountered a defensive complex that had stalled multiple assaults. Reinforced concrete, multiple firing slits, interlocking fields of fire. 2 tanks had already failed to neutralize it. An airstrike had missed. Stein studied it for seconds, not minutes. He understood that accuracy was irrelevant. At close range, volume alone could overwhelm narrow apertures. He advanced to 50 yards, went prone to stabilize, and emptied an ammunition box into the firing slits. 7 seconds. At least a third of the rounds found their way inside. The guns fell silent. Engineers moved immediately. Explosives followed. The position collapsed. This was the peak of effectiveness. The Stinger, though battered, still delivered what no other weapon on the beach could at that moment. Mobile, immediate, overwhelming firepower. Company A surged forward again. Another 50 yards. Then another. For the first time since landing, the Japanese defensive line bent instead of absorbing pressure. Positions were not merely suppressed, they were abandoned. Enemy soldiers began withdrawing through tunnel systems rather than holding firing points to the last. Stein felt the shift before he saw it. The sound of incoming fire changed. Less confident. More sporadic. The enemy was no longer dictating tempo. But control never lasts long in war. The weapon's rate of fire dropped slightly, a sign that heat and damage were catching up. The trigger required more force. The bipod loosened. A bullet struck the barrel with a metallic crack, bending it just enough to matter. The stinger still fired. But now it was wounded. Stein knew what that meant. The window was closing. As long as the gun worked at all, he could maintain momentum. Once it failed, everything would stop at once. There would be no gradual transition back to doctrine. There would be collapse. He did not slow down. He fired again, pushed again, and ran again, forcing the last usable minutes out of the system he had created. This phase was about extraction, not endurance. About gaining as much ground as possible before reality reasserted itself. By the time Stein reached the next defensive line, the signs were unmistakable. The weapon coughed instead of roared. Heat warped metal. The rhythm that had carried the unit forward for hours began to falter. Control was slipping. And the enemy could feel it too. The moment control slipped, the battlefield changed character. It did not collapse all at once. It tightened. The stinger no longer roared. It coughed. Each burst came shorter than Stein intended, the rate of fire sagging as heat warped metal and fouling accumulated inside the receiver. The trigger resisted his finger, sometimes sticking, sometimes releasing only a handful of rounds before cutting out. The weapon was no longer a force multiplier. It was a liability that still happened to fire. The Japanese noticed immediately. Fire no longer reacted blindly to sound. It waited. It tracked. Sniper rounds cracked closer now, aimed not at movement in general, but at Stein specifically. Mortars adjusted their spacing, bracketing his routes with deliberate precision instead of guesswork. The enemy had stopped responding to chaos and started exploiting pattern. And Stein had created a pattern. Barefoot runs. The same approaches. The same timing. What had been predictable to him was now predictable to them. During one return run, a round snapped past his head close enough to sting his ear. He dropped flat into the ash, pressing himself down as the next shot struck where his chest had been a second earlier. For the first time that day, Stein was pinned. Not stalled. Pinned. The difference mattered. Pinned meant the enemy was no longer reacting to him. They were controlling him. Stein lay still, breathing shallow, letting seconds pass. The sniper was disciplined. No follow-up shot. No wasted ammunition. The shooter waited for movement. Stein understood the geometry instantly. The shot angle told him the sniper was elevated, probably in a spider hole or behind volcanic rock on a ridgeline. Distance, roughly 200 yards. Far enough that a bolt-action rifle could dominate open ground. Close enough that the stinger, if it fired, could overwhelm it. If. Stein rolled left and came up running. Not away. Toward. Running perpendicular to the line of fire reduced the sniper's lead. Closing distance forced reaction. 3 shots rang out behind him. All misses. At 150 yards, Stein saw movement. A dark shape against darker rock. He dropped to one knee, shouldered the weapon, and pressed the trigger. The stinger responded sluggishly, firing a ragged burst that tore into the stone around the spider hole. Rock exploded. Dust and debris swallowed the position. When the burst ended, there was no return fire. Stein did not pause to confirm. He reloaded by feel, hands blistered and shaking, then continued forward until he was certain the threat was neutralized. By the time he returned to Company A's forward elements, the situation had worsened. Japanese defenses ahead were no longer isolated positions. They were integrated systems. Pillboxes arranged in arcs. Trenches connecting them. Mutual support from positions Stein could not reach alone. The Stinger was now critically damaged. The barrel was visibly bent. The bipod had broken off completely. The stock was charred to the point of crumbling under his grip. The rate of fire had dropped by nearly half. What had once been overwhelming volume was now merely heavy fire. Still faster than anything else on the line. But no longer decisive on its own. Stein advanced anyway. He fired to suppress one position, then another, working methodically across the arc. Each burst bought less time than before. Riflemen advanced, but slower now, hesitating as incoming fire resumed more quickly. The rhythm that had carried them forward earlier began to break down. Then the Stinger was hit. A machine gun round struck the receiver with a violent metallic crack, ripping the weapon from Stein's hands and throwing it backward into the ash. For a fraction of a second, everything stopped. Stein was standing in the open, unarmed, exposed to multiple firing positions that now knew exactly where he was. This was the point of no return. He dove behind a low ridge of rock as rounds stitched the ground where he had been. The Stinger lay 10 feet away, smoking, half buried in ash. Japanese gunners had seen it fall. They were waiting for him to try to retrieve it. Stein did not hesitate. He sprinted. Rounds snapped past him, close enough to feel the pressure wave. He reached the weapon, grabbed it, and rolled into cover as another burst tore into the rock behind him. Inside the crater, he worked frantically, ripping out the damaged belt, forcing the feed mechanism back into alignment with bare fingers. The weapon fed. Barely. Stein rose and emptied an entire ammunition box into the position that had shot him. 7 seconds of fire. The enemy gun went silent. But the cost was undeniable. The Stinger was now operating on borrowed time measured in moments. Each burst risked catastrophic failure. Each reload took longer. Stein's hands were slick with blood, his own and others. His feet were torn open, ash ground into every wound. Japanese fire intensified. Grenades landed closer. Riflemen appeared in trenches within 30 yards. Stein fired at shapes now, not positions, suppressing long enough for his unit to throw grenades and close. By mid-afternoon, Company A had reached its objective, but Stein was finished. A grenade detonated near him, shrapnel tearing into his leg and back. He stayed upright long enough to fire again, suppressing another position while engineers moved forward. Only when the adrenaline ebbed did the blood loss assert itself. A corpsman reached him and told him plainly, evacuation or death. This time, Stein did not argue. He handed the Stinger to another Marine. The weapon that had carried the advance for hours was almost unrecognizable, warped, blackened, barely functional. Stein himself was no better. As he was carried back toward the beach, the battlefield continued without him. The momentum he had created did not collapse immediately. Others exploited it, paid for it, extended it. Control had been lost, but not without consequence. The system Stein had built from scrap and refusal had burned itself out exactly as expected. It had never been meant to last. It had been meant to change the situation before it failed. And it had done that. Tony Stein did not see the end of the battle he helped unlock. When he was carried off the line on the afternoon of February 19, the momentum he had forced into existence continued without him. Company A held its gains. Other units exploited the breach. The beachhead, once static and lethal, began to stretch inland in uneven, bloody increments. Stein's weapon did not survive the day. The Stinger was too damaged to repair. The barrel was warped. The receiver scarred. The improvised trigger unreliable beyond trust. Like most field modifications, it vanished into the churn of combat, stripped for parts or discarded when it no longer fired. No serial number. No inventory record. No official acknowledgement. The Marine Corps did not adopt it. It could not. 6 improvised weapons in a single regiment did not justify rewriting doctrine. The logistics were impossible. The maintenance demands unacceptable. The risk too high to formalize. On paper, the Stinger was an anomaly. A footnote at best. Stein himself would not live to see even that. On March 1, 1945, during a reconnaissance patrol days after returning to the line against medical advice, he was killed instantly by a single sniper round. No dramatic charge. No final stand. One shot. One moment. The war continued without pause. He was 23. The Medal of Honor came later. Posthumous. Clinical in language. It counted trips, distances, enemy dead. It noted the personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, without naming it. The citation did not mention bare feet. It did not describe heat, ash, or the way momentum feels when it finally breaks free. Those details lived only with the men who watched it happen. Strategically, the battle for Iwo Jima changed nothing overnight. The island was still taken yard by yard. Casualties remained catastrophic. Doctrine did not shift because of one man and one weapon. But at the level where wars are actually fought, something had been exposed. The assumption that correct systems always outperform improvised ones had cracked. The belief that doctrine could anticipate every battlefield had proven false. For a few hours on a volcanic beach, effectiveness came not from adherence to rules, but from understanding when they no longer applied. That lesson did not fit neatly into manuals. It traveled instead through memory. Through stories passed between Marines about a barefoot corporal who kept an entire company moving when everything else failed. About a weapon that should not have worked, but did. About a man who treated combat like an engineering problem and accepted the cost when the solution burned itself out. Nothing about Stein's actions was sustainable. That was the point. They were never meant to be repeated as doctrine. They were meant to solve a problem that existed only in that moment, under those conditions, with no acceptable alternatives. When the battle ended weeks later, Iwo Jima was secured at enormous cost. The flag was raised. Photographs froze history into a single image. The island became a symbol. Stein did not appear in that frame. But beneath the symbolism, beneath the abstractions of victory and sacrifice, his contribution remained brutally specific. He bought time. He created motion. He forced a system to move forward when it had stalled. War did not reward him for that while he lived. History barely remembers the weapon at all. What remains is the uncomfortable truth his actions left behind. That sometimes the difference between failure and progress is not a better plan, but a single person willing to act outside the one everyone else trusts.